Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of the Shabtai Tzvi series. This episode is about Nathan of Gaza, his life, his influence and position and part in the movement, as well as we discuss a newly published, new edition, actually, of a work collected of his writings. This episode, once again, is being sponsored by the corporate sponsor of this series, Glock Plumbing. For all your service needs, big or small in New Jersey, with a full service division from boiler changeouts, main sewer line snakeouts, cameraing main lines to a simple faucet leak, Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1. That's 732-523-1836, extension 1. Once again, for any comments or feedback or to sponsor a show, email me, sfarimchatter@gmail.com. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast and another episode of our ongoing series on Shabtai Tzvi. On this edition of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Avinoam Stillman, who is working on his PhD at the Free University in Berlin, researching early modern Kabbalah, and he is the co-founder of Blima Books, which is a small publisher, newish publisher located in Israel. And they just published a brand new edition of B'Iqvot Mashiach, which is Gershom Sholom's, writings of Nathan of Gaza, who the topic of this episode will be on Nathan of Gaza, who I know have discussed in other episodes, but this will be an episode dedicated exclusively to him. So first of all, thank you, Avinoam, for joining me.
Thank you so much.
So start off, tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
So I grew up in Brookline, Massachusetts. And I guess for relevant to our conversation today, I grew up very much in the orbit of what I would call academic Hasidus in a bunch of different ways. My first yichus, which I should, name my heritage, my grandfather, Menachem Schmelzer, who was the librarian at the Jewish Theological Seminary and remains a great scholar who knows just about everything. So it was really an honor to, and changed my life, obviously, to grow up around him and his books and his knowledge. And on the other side of things is the sort of Hasidic side of things. I grew up going to a Beit Midrash, a Beis Medrash, a Shtibel, a small synagogue, depending on who you asked. Of the Tolner Rebbe, Rabbi Professor Isidore Twersky, Yitzchak Asher Twersky, the Rebbe of Tolna, who was also the professor, the great, professor and head of Jewish studies at Harvard, expert on the Rambam. I'm sure he's been mentioned on this podcast before. And also sort of related to a certain Boston school of Neo-Hasidism. So Art Green, people like Shaul Magid, Nehemiah Polin, all of these people, I was really lucky to have them be teachers, thanks to the world in which I was raised. And so it was sort of natural, although nothing is obvious, that I went into academia. I did my undergraduate education at Columbia University. I studied with Elisheva Karlebach there, among many other really valued teachers. And then I went to Israel, to Ben Gurion University, to do my master's degree with Professor Yonatan Meir, where I wrote a thesis about the printing of Hasidic and Kabbalistic books in Koretz in the late 18th century. So sort of about Hebrew printing and Kabbalah. And I'm now working on a intellectual biography of Meir Poppers, who was one of the great Lurianic Kabbalists and editors of the writings of Rav Chaim Vital in the early 17th century, and somebody who very likely knew Nathan of Gaza when Nathan was just a young boy running around the streets of Jerusalem. So maybe we'll get into that in a minute.
Yeah, interestingly, Rameir Popper's Vat Shalom has been publishing like all his writings the past year and a half. I mean, they're just publishing like everything, which is manuscript, and it's been interesting. So, I mean, I'm just to ask you, like, that you got into Kabbalah, does that have to do with your grandfather? Does that have to do with Professor Twersky?
My grandfather, who knows everything, is not into Kabbalah, I would say. So I think it's the other side of things. I usually tell people who asked me why I got into studying Kabbalah, that it was everywhere growing up, in the sense that people were mentioning Kabbalistic ideas. There were Kabbalistic practices, Lag BaOmer, what have you, singing Bar Yochai on Friday nights. Kabbalah was omnipresent in my life, and yet nobody seemed to really know what it was. Being a curious kid, I ended up trying to figure out what is this thing that keeps coming up, and I'm still trying to figure that out.
Right. Now, one more thing I'll ask you. I mean, we'll get more to this at the end, but once, I guess this is part of your biography, so to speak, about you, before we get into Nathan, is this Blima Books. I mean, what is Blima Books, and why did you, while you're studying, why did you found this small press?
Right. So when I was studying in Ben Gurion, I had a conversation once with my dear friend, Yossi Schweig, who's the other founder of Blima Books. And we were talking about something which students of Yonatan Meir were often exposed to, which is the fact that there are all sorts of weird writings hidden in archives or in newspapers or, all sorts in manuscripts. And this desire to get some of these hidden things into the light, right? And obviously in Hebrew, to publish is literally lehotzi laor, to bring to light. And we started playing with this idea of starting a small press. And our first book was a collection of essays by Yosef Weiss, who Gershom Sholem called his greatest student, a great scholar of Breslov Hasidism and of many other topics. So we published a small collection of his writings. And since then, with a lot of support and a lot of collaborations, Blima has been growing, and we've been publishing more and more books, really, with a few different angles. The most important to us, I would say, is quality over quantity. Right? We invest a lot of care and attention into the design of the books, particularly in the digital age. There's no real reason to publish a book that's not a beautiful object. You could just read it on your screen. So we really invest in that. And we're also trying to bring up things that we call radical Jewish literature, things that are a little off the beaten path. So our most recent publication, and relevant to the podcast today, is B'Iqvot Mashiach, which was the first collection of writings of Nathan of Gaza. And we'll have more to say about what's in that book and all sorts of connections, but published by Gershom Sholem in 1944. So really quite a fraught period to be publishing a book like this. There were all sorts of troubles with the publication, but eventually it came out in a very few copies. And so it's sort of a bibliophilic treasure for those in the know. Have been on the lookout for it, and we've republished it now, edited by Yonatan Meir, our teacher, and working. He's worked with a lot of scholars of Hasidism, of Sabbatianism, including Noam Leffler, Yossi Chayes, Eliezer Baumgarten, to sort of bring in more texts. So not only is this the original of Sholem's edition of Nathan's writings, which was unavailable until now, it's also a bunch of newly discovered and copied from manuscript texts that you can now order and read in the comfort of your home.
So we'll get to more of that at the end, and obviously I'll include the link to purchase the book. So let's get into Nathan a little bit. The listeners may be familiar, may have listened to previous episodes where Nathan came up, of course, because the story of Shabtai Tzvi is intertwined with Nathan. Obviously, depending on how important Nathan was, obviously that's Sholem, and people that disagree with Sholem. So I'm sure we'll get into that. But let's start with Nathan's his biography. When was he born? His teachers, where did he learn, etc.
Yeah. So I think if I'm just going to open the stage, right, we're in Jerusalem, right? We're in Yerushalayim, and it's the middle of the 17th century. So the year is 1644, and the Ashkenazi community in Yerushalayim has been, quite active for decades, even centuries, right? We know that there are Ashkenazi Jews going back to Yerushalayim in the Middle Ages, at this point in history, Yerushalayim is really a center of Kabbalah that is connected by all sorts of networks to the rest of the Jewish world. So when Nathan is born in 1644, he's really born at a really charmed time and place where he has surrounding him some of the best yeshivot. He learns growing up in the yeshiva of Yaakov Chagiz, whose son would eventually become the first great, or maybe the second great enemy of Sabbatinism, Moshe Chagiz, about whom Elisheva Karlebach has written such an important work, Pursuit of Heresy. But Yaakov Chagiz has this yeshiva. Nathan is educated. Nathan's father, Elisha Chaim Ashkenazi, has one of the most common professions among Ashkenazi Jews of the period, which is he asks for charity. If I were being less charitable myself, I might call him a schnorrer, but he's a lot more than that, actually, because Elisha goes all across the Jewish world. We know he's in North Africa, he's in Italy, he's in the Ottoman Empire. He's really, like so many Jews of the early modern period, extremely mobile, going from place to place and involved in publishing, right? So we know he helps publish the Magid Meisharim, the dream journal, or sort of the record of the divine inspirations of Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, of course. So this is somebody who's a real scholar, has an investment in Kabbalah, and is also well connected around the entire Jewish world. And so that is Nathan's father. And so, we can assume that he only saw his father every so often, right? His father was out traveling, but Nathan grows up in this environment where on the one hand, he knows he's in Yerushalayim. He's really in the center of the Kabbalistic world at the time, right? The Jewish community in Tzfat had really gone down earlier towards the end of the 16th century. And if you're in Eretz Yisrael, Jerusalem is the place to be. So he grows up really at that period. In his youth, I would just say around that same time, we have a very crucial moment in the history of Kabbalah also, which is the discovery of many writings of Chaim Vital. Right, the greatest student of Isaac Luria, of Chaim Vital, had hidden a bunch of his writings in a geniza. It's a long story that we won't talk about now, but suddenly in the world in which Nathan lives, all of these new Kabbalistic texts had been studied. And so in the years of his youth, there's a very active group of Kabbalists in Yerushalayim, led by Yaakov Tzemach, a fascinating character who really deserves much longer conversation, so I won't jump into it now. But he's in a world that's really rich. I think that's what's important to say, and that there are a lot of intellectual and religious resources at his fingertips.
Okay, so I just want to mention one thing for the listener, just because I thought of this right now. You mentioned Yaakov Tzemach, you mentioned Meir Poppers. If there are interest from the listeners to hear more episodes about, various famous Kabbalim, they can email me and let me know, maybe with you, Avinoam, or others we can do in the future episode. Just putting that out there. I always need feedback if there's an interest in such a thing. But okay, we'll leave that on the side. So at what point did Nathan begin to really learn and study Kabbalah? And was that a normal thing at his age? Because I think I've discussed this on the previous episodes in the series, but he was very, very young when the story of the whole Shabtai Tzvi broke, and he must have been even younger when he started learning Kabbalah. So
yeah. So he tells us actually when he started when he was 20 years old, and that may sound young, but it's not actually that young. I mean, think about it. It's a time when somebody might go into university today and learn all sorts of complicated subjects. So if you're a brilliant young student in 17th century Yerushalayim, of course you're going to start studying Kabbalah. For whatever it's worth, Nathan had been married earlier in the year. This is 1664. Due to his marriage, he moved to Gaza, right, where he really becomes associated. Obviously, we call him Nathan of Gaza. I don't think it was exceptional. I think Nathan was exceptional, by which I mean to say that there was no strict barrier at the time of when one should or shouldn't start learning Kabbalah. Most of those rules actually come about much later in the century due to the outgrowth of Sabbatianism. So there is this sense, particularly in the 18th century, but earlier as well, that it's dangerous to learn Kabbalah if you're too young. And that actually has precedence, as Moshe Idel has shown, in prohibitions against studying philosophy in the Middle Ages before certain ages. So there are all sorts of these laws, these rules, but they're not really strict, and they're not enforced for sure. So I would say Nathan, there was nothing, nobody would have looked askance at him for studying Kabbalah. At the same time, he's clearly brilliant. He's an Ilui of some sort, whatever that term means, right? He's a young, brilliant scholar who, in a really remarkably short period of time, masters, he says of himself that he knew 3 of the 6 orders of Mishnah by heart. So, not bad. It's like that classic joke, right? Somebody asks you, do you know the whole Talmud? I say, yeah, I know half. So he was that kind of guy. But from there, he then went into studying Kabbalah. And I think the key thing here also, aside from the fact of his brilliance, is that he did it as part of a pious practice. And he writes about fasting, about doing tikkunim, right? Various practices prescribed by Isaac Luria and by the other Lurianic Kabbalists in order to purify your soul, in order to overcome any sins. He writes in one letter, I didn't do anything too bad, but just in case, I did all sorts of tikkunim, I did all sorts of things to fix myself. So his studies, right, his theoretical studies of Kabbalah come along with his practical ritual investment in a very, very intense ascetic lifestyle.
So I think something that we often have to emphasize, like you said, the Arizal's writings, Lurianic Kabbalah, as we call it, came about at this time. So that was something that he was very well versed in, as opposed to earlier, I'm not so well versed, Moshe Cordovero, other Kabbalistic learning. So was that, obviously, Sholem makes a big deal about this in general for the whole Sabbatian movement, but was that, Nathan, this was something that he was very well versed in, right?
Yeah, I think my assumption for most of these people is that they read anything they could get their hands on, right? So we know, for example, there's a very fascinating manuscript that's held in the Jewish Theological Seminary that was owned by Nathan's father. It's actually the manuscript that has the autograph of the famous Shabbos song Yedid Nefesh, Rabbi Elazar Zikri. So this has all sorts of different Kabbalistic texts in it as well. And we know that Nathan saw that. He leaves his handwriting in there a few times. If you go through his writings, he's constantly quoting the Ari. He clearly knows the Zohar backwards and forwards. He knows the Sefer HaPliyah, right? There are all sorts of different Kabbalistic sources which he's relying on. I think he does have although he himself is of Ashkenazi origin, right, which is important, because that's part of why he has such a wide reach later on. He's able to sort of work those connections probably from his father even and spread the good news once the Messianic movement is already underway. But from a sort of intellectual point of view, he's very much an Ottoman Kabbalist. So he's interested in all sorts of writings, but the writings of Kitvei Ha'ari, of the Lurianic tradition, those are the core. And then he's reading all sorts of other things as well.
Right, and maybe we'll talk about it, explain a little bit what that means versus the other Kabbalah if we get into Sholem a little bit. But let's get, I guess, to Shabbos Tzvi right now. So when does he first hear of Shabbos Tzvi? Obviously, we're not going to go super in depth into Shabbos Tzvi. That's been discussed in other episodes. But when does he first hear of him?
So again, the assumption is, and we don't have any clear proof of this, but that they must have met in Jerusalem. We know Shabtai Tzvi is in Yerushalayim in those same years. And we know that Nathan's first prophecies, which we'll talk about, I think, in a moment, are really, Shabtai Tzvi shows up in those prophecies even before he's formally announced Shabtai being the Mashiach. So, these were small communities. I think it's important to keep in mind Jerusalem then and Jerusalem now are not similar places, right? It's more like, some small town in Iowa. If somebody comes through and they're two Kabbalists, they're going to meet each other, right? So I don't think, although there's no proof, real concrete proof of their meeting, it's obvious that it would have happened.
So then you allude to Nathan has this revelation, he has this prophecy. I mean, when does that happen? Relate the story. This is a pretty interesting story, and then what happens after that?
Yeah, so in 1665, he writes. We know this from letters that Nathan wrote a few years later. A few days before Purim. Most people have visions on Purim, but he has a vision a few days before Purim. This moment of fasting, and he hears a heavenly voice, right, saying, "In a little over a year, the Mashiach is going to come." And from then on, things happen very quickly. And I won't get into all the details of the timeline because even I've gotten sort of confused, trying to put the pieces together. Everybody who hasn't gone out and gotten a copy of Gershom Sholom's Shabtai Tzvi, highly recommend it. But essentially, in a short period of time, Nathan starts having all sorts of revelations. Some of these are in the form of just hearing a voice that says, like I said, the Messiah is going to come. He then has a pretty intensive vision, which he describes as seeing the Merkava, right? He's seeing the divine chariot, and an angelic figure comes and tells him that there's this Messiah named Shabtai Tzvi, who's born in 1626. He's going to come. It's going to be a whole thing, right? He has these sort of personalized prophecies. And then there's also a phenomenon of what we might call automatic writing, which means he's writing things that he doesn't perceive of as coming from himself, right? He's sort of channeling other forces. And that is manifested in a text that's known as the Vision of Avraham HaChassid, which is a really, really out there text that basically claims to have been written by a medieval Ashkenazi mystic who prophesies the coming of Shabtai Tzvi, and various versions. Elijah, Eliyahu HaNavi comes and shows Nathan where to find this text, or it's just dictated to him from heaven, or what have you. But this becomes one of the primary sources as well upon which they build the vision of Sabbatianism, right? That it was prophesied all those years ago.
Okay, so then he gets up and he obviously pronounces Shabtai Tzvi as the Mashiach. I mean, when is his first public pronouncement, and who hears this?
So what happens is Shabtai Tzvi comes to visit, seemingly not expecting to become the Mashiach, right? Apparently, right, we spoke about how Nathan did all these tikkunim, right? He did things to fix himself. Well, he became known also as someone to whom you could go if you were having troubles, who could provide some sort of healing, almost like a Baal Shem, right, in later generations, a magical healer who knew Kabbalah. And Shabtai, we won't go into it, but had a tortured life, clearly. However we want to diagnose him in retrospect, had serious mental imbalances, times of intense depression, times of intense, joy. So he comes to Nathan really looking for help. And Nathan says, "Oh no, actually, this thing that you've come to get me to heal you from is actually the clearest sign that you're the Mashiach," right? And this moment that, it could have turned out quite differently, but Nathan really, really jumps on it. And from that moment onward, he starts sending letters, right? So I alluded to this before. I'm sure there was a public pronouncement in Gaza, right? And the news makes it to Yerushalayim, and it's a local event. But what turns this from something that's just sort of a local uproar or enthusiasm to a global movement, which it becomes in a remarkably fast period of time, is Nathan's skill at sending letters and his knowledge that that's a viable thing to do, right? Shabtai Tzvi himself clearly thought of himself as the Mashiach. Earlier in his life, even, he had all sorts of theological insights of his own. I don't think he would have jumped on the possibility of doing a propaganda campaign, right, or an advertisement campaign. And what Nathan is able to do because of his situation and because of his knowledge of this network of charity, and this has been argued recently by Adam Teller in a great article about Sabbatianism in the aftermath of the Khmelnytsky pogroms and the sort of the wars of the early 17th century, mid-17th century. Nathan sends out letters, and there used to be really one letter that was well known. It's a letter of somebody that he sent to a chacham named Raphael Yosef, right, in Egypt, in which he describes the coming of Shabtai Tzvi. But recently, and these are included in the new edition of B'Iqvot Mashiach, we've discovered some new letters. So Yonatan Meir has published now a letter that he wrote to the communities of Poland. We know from the writings of Yaakov Emden that he wrote letters to all sorts of communities across the Ottoman Empire. We have another letter that he sent to Sofia, Bulgaria, right? He's really actively sending out these letters. And what the letters do is they combine his visions and his theology with appended all sorts of tikkunim and practices and rituals and liturgies that should be done as part of greeting and preparing the way for the coming of the Messiah. So not only does Nathan spread the news, he gives people practical tools to express their belief in the Mashiach, right? And this is what turns it into a movement that is almost on the border of being a new religion, in the sense that it has its own practices that set it apart, and that obviously belief is central. Nathan loves quoting the verse, Tzadik be'emunato yichyeh, right? The righteous will live through his belief, which is the Roshei Tevot, the acronym of Tzvi, right? That he loves that. But at the same time, there's very practical rituals. So that's sort of one side of his announcement of Shabtai Tzvi's arrival. The other side, which I should note, is also published now in B'Iqvot Mashiach, is his first attempt to create a real thorough theology. Right now, he does some of this in his letters, but really he dives in a book called Drush HaTaninim, right, the treatise on the dragons or the serpents, in which he develops a really complicated theory of the soul of the Mashiach, which is in this very complex dialectical, whatever that means, relationship to the forces of evil, right, which already in the Torah and then later in the Zohar are imaged as these dragons or serpents. And this becomes really the seed of all the subsequent thought, because, Nathan, he's an excitable person. He's a prophet. He has these fits and possessions, but he's also a very intellectual person, and he knows that Shabtai Tzvi is a bit of a strange character, right? A strange bird who doesn't behave according to the norms of the society. So he needs to use all of his intellectual might to justify why the Messiah looks like Shabtai.
So, I mean, the thing is, he's only like 21, even if he is, this genius and he's big, Kabbalist. I mean, and he writes these letters and he has this campaign, but why does everybody fall for it? Everybody just, okay, great, this is the Mashiach.
Yeah, I mean, that's the $1 million question, and there's a million answers to the $1 million question. And they're probably all partially right. I mean, this is the way history works. There's never one answer. First of all, I would just say, when somebody writes you a letter in 1665 and he doesn't write, I'm 20 years old, so you have no idea, right? You're sitting in Krakow and you get a letter from Eretz Yisrael, that's a big deal. So I think part of it is just the geography. Shalom really emphasizes this. If it hadn't happened in the land of Israel, people probably wouldn't have taken it as seriously. So there's a certain way in which the geography shapes the movement. The other factors, I think, are just generally, I think messianic movements are less rare than we think there are. There's a whole line of people who attempted, to be Mashiach, Shlomo Molcho, David Reuveni. I mean, there's a long list. Asher Limlin, right? You could get into these. They're all fascinating characters, and they all have some success. Nobody as much as Shabtai. And I do think that the role of the Khmelnytsky massacres is extremely important here. And this, again, Adam Teller has written about recently based on earlier research. We're dealing with a world in which there's a knowledge that the Polish Jewish community has really taken a hit, right, and has scattered across the Jewish world. And there's, I would say the mirror image of the propaganda network that I described of Nathan's ability to send out letters is the fact that there's really a refugee network across the Jewish world. And not to be too Ashke normative or Ashke centric here, right? Obviously, there are Jews in Yemen who are also deeply interested in all of this, and they probably aren't thinking too much about Khmelnytsky. But I think each community probably had its own factors. And for example, I would really recommend, as in Yaakov Dweck's recent book on Yaakov Sasportas, right, he brings out the local flavor in Amsterdam, right, and in Hamburg, right, what is really going on in those communities. So we're always playing this game of zooming out and giving the big picture and zooming in the little picture, and it's all at play.
Another interesting aspect here is his, what's his relationship like with Shabtai Tzvi? Obviously, he meets him, he tells him he's Mashiach, and he has a pronouncement. But he actually, you correct me if I'm wrong, he doesn't have that much of a personal relationship. They don't meet each other, not with each other so much after this. And so what is his relationship in general with him in person and via his correspondence with him?
Yeah, they're not close. He's not the closest person to Shabtai in many ways. Which leaves him open. I mean, the fact is that he's taken by surprise by many things, right? One of the things with Nathan is you see somebody who, maybe this is a character trait we could see in other people, right? We see somebody who's at a young age feels like he's totally in control, and as he grows older, is successively losing control and losing his ability to really justify or explain the situation. There's a certain tragedy in that, right? And so it's true, they don't meet that many times. They communicate by messengers. There's some letters from one to another. It's hard to say, really. I think clearly, Sholem paints this picture in which he describes Nathan as the brains, and Shabtai just sort of happened to be there, right? It's a weird fluke. That's clearly not true, right? Shabtai Tzvi obviously was charismatic. He had beliefs of his own. He may have been a bit erratic, but he was not a fool. And Nathan must have, on some level, been a bit afraid of him. I mean, I think we can take Nathan's belief at face value, and he must have had a certain amount of awe and sort of not believing that, in fact, he was the prophet of the Messiah.
Then, obviously, Shabtai converts and he becomes the Muslim. I mean, what is Nathan's opinion? I mean, what does he have to say? We have in Sholem's other book, I think Mechkarim or Mukaros told us, right, the Shabtai, he has in there the letter that on his opinion, I think that's in there on the conversion, right? So, I mean, what does he have to say about it? How does he explain this?
Right. So Nathan, I think he's taken by surprise. On the one hand, he doesn't expect Shabtai to convert because he had prophesied that Shabtai was going to overcome the Sultan and take over the Ottoman Empire, right? Like it's not in line with his own prophecies. At the same time, his theology already in books like Drusha Taninim allows him to explain for the fact that the Messiah is going to do things that are totally unprecedented. And so it's not very difficult for him theologically to start explaining away, well, this is something that, the Mashiach has to go into the forces of evil or into the other side, the Sitra Achra, in order to take back the sparks. He's going into the enemy camp from the inside, and he'll throw it, he'll turn it over. Those sorts of concepts are very easy for Nathan to relate to and to elaborate. What is much harder for him is the fact that Shabtai Tzvi starts inviting other people to convert with him, which is really beyond the pale. Everything we know about Nathan is that on the whole, he basically followed halakha. He basically encouraged other people to follow halakha, right, and normative Jewish practice, with a few exceptions. Tisha B'Av, right, not fasting on Tisha B'Av was a major thing. His relationship to the practice of kavanot, the special prayer intentions or meditations of Lurianic Kabbalah, was mixed, because that the need to do those meditations changes when Mashiach comes, because obviously the whole cosmos has changed. But with Shabtai Tzvi's own conversion, he can deal. It's when other people start converting that he doesn't really know what to do. And that may explain part of his distance from Shabtai. I think he was probably petrified that he would have an encounter with Shabtai Tzvi where he would be told to convert and he would be trapped, right? Because he didn't want to convert to Islam. And at the same time, it probably would have been very hard for him to refuse a direct command from the Mashiach. Yeah.
I mean, so what was really his pivotal role? I mean, what was his place in the movement? Obviously, he was extremely important, but there's, Sholem and not, there's everyone said, who was more important, Shabtai or Nathan? I mean, what is really his ultimate? I don't know if there's an answer, like you said, to something else before, like there's no exact answer. Is that the answer here? He's just very important, and there's no exact way to define how much?
I mean, there are also different criteria for importance, right? So I think I would say two things. One is Nathan was important because the Sabbatean movement as a movement probably never would have happened without him, right? His ability early on, within months, to write compelling letters and compelling treatises about the movement and creating at least a general theology and creating rituals that could be practiced really all over the Jewish world and that eventually get printed, right, quite early on. So not only is he sending letters in manuscript, he's also, his writings are spreading in print. Sabbateanism wouldn't have happened without him. And so that obviously is tremendously important. That doesn't mean he could have done it alone. At the same time, I really think that if Shabtai Tzvi, lo haya v'lo nivra, if there had never been a Shabtai Tzvi in history, in an alternate reality, right, there was no Shabtai Tzvi, Nathan would probably be considered one of the greatest Kabbalists of the 17th century. And in certain ways, the focus on Shabtai Tzvi has caused us to lose track of his cosmological, speculative, theoretical, whatever sets of adjectives we want to use, but his Kabbalistic world, which obviously is used to justify Shabtai Tzvi in many ways, but it's used in many, many different contexts as well. And this is somebody who writes massive works of Kabbalah at a time when much of the rest of the Jewish world is still trying to assimilate and understand Lurianic Kabbalah, right? So if, in very sort of generalized sense, by this point in the mid-17th century, there aren't very many new Kabbalistic systems because the writings of the Ari are so complicated, right? And there's so many different versions. And it's such a big picture from the beginning of creation until the demons, that are running around on the floor, presumably in the room next to me. There's just a lot of material to go through. There's a lot of work to do just to understand those writings. And so for somebody to then, in the midst of that moment, which is really dedicated to sort of assimilating and understanding and editing and commenting on this new canon, this new set of holy texts, right, which hadn't been available earlier, for somebody then to go write his own work of theology, which shows that he's mastered that material, but then is also, talking about things which nobody has ever talked about before. I mean, there's nobody who does that, as far as I know.
And so on a related note to this, I mean, the opinion of Nathan as a Kabbalist and the opinion of him as a whole throughout the years since, obviously it's not good. Not he was involved with this movement and heretical, Shabbos Tzvi. But reading here Yaakov as a recent book, and called Shabt Ut Hibitim Historiographium, and I'll read what he says in this book. So Barnai, he quotes here in the book. He quotes from first of all Moshe Chagiz, who was Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz's son, where Nathan learned in yeshiva from Shever Poshim. He said he writes against the Sabbatians, and he's starting from Shabbos Tzvi, Yaakov Quirdo, Shlomo Florentine, Yosef Filosof, Cardozo, Nechemia Chichio, and Shlomo Ayalon. There's no Nathan of Gaza. He's missing. That's number one. Number two is he brings Rabbi Yaakov Emden. In Teres HaKnois, Yaakov Emden famously writes against a lot of figures, obviously very involved in this, and he writes, I'll just read the quote for the listeners. It says, Yesh Oimrim Shebenasa Yerushalayim Darba Eretz Yisrael, and he was traveling to Yerushalayim, he lived in Eretz Yisrael, Baba Makam Azi, came to Gaza, Shabbos. V'sham haya Yehudi, there was a Jew, Nasan Binyamin Ashkenazi, Vayihi Shabbos Tzvi B'Beisi, he was in his house. Upisoim Nasa Zen Nasan Anal Navi, Nasan became right away into a prophet. So I guess he says it did have a bad ruach into his mouth. And truth, he had a lot of true prophecies. This is what he had in the past, he had in the future. So, I mean, that's not exactly Rabbi Yaakov Emden. We're all familiar with how he writes about, especially in this topic, and this is not exactly made true nevuah. So, I mean, interesting, what's with the overall reception, and why is there suddenly here the two famous authors that we know write against, Sabbatianism are not writing very sharp against him?
Yeah, I think there's something interesting going on here, which is that, we've learned from scholars like Elisha Karlbach and others that the creation of what we call orthodoxy, right, and sort of strict lines of what is acceptable belief, what is unacceptable belief, right, that's a process that happens, of course, over the course of Jewish history, but particularly around the Sabbatean movement. And a lot of these lines begin to get drawn in this period. And that said, it's not like one day everybody wakes up and has a clear playbook for this is heresy and this is not. And I think there's a much more subtle and complex relationship with somebody like Nathan. Shabtai Tzvi, it's easy to write off because he didn't write much, right? He was the Mashiach, but there's not that much else going for him. Nathan is perceived incorrectly, but importantly, as the author of massively popular and influential books like the Chemdat Yamim. Rav Yechiel Goldhaber has written about this, and there's a long string of scholars who've written about this. I'm sure it's worth talking about in the future. But this book, Chemdat Yamim, right, becomes one of the cornerstones of sort of Kabbalistic Musar, or, ethical literature, practice, all these things in the 18th century. And many people perceive it as having been written by Nathan. And Nathan himself, is seen as a redeemable figure. So, maybe the most famous example is Rabbi Yehuda Pitaya, the great Baghdadi Kabbalist, a student of the Ben Ish Chai, grandfather of the great Kabbalah scholar Chaviva Pitaya, I should note. Rabbi Yehuda Pitaya says that he was metaken, right? He fixed the soul of Natan so that we can now learn his books with impunity. And even earlier, Rav Chaim Palachi is very much okay with the fact that people are going to Nathan's grave in Skopje, Macedonia, a city where I was lucky enough to visit, actually for a conference marking Nathan of Gaza a few years ago. He's okay with the fact that people are going to that grave and continued to go to that grave up until the Holocaust. we have Nathan's gravestone, and we know that people went there, the inscription at least. And I think part of this also, and this is backtracking a little bit, but it's important, is that Nathan, at the end of the Sabbatean movement, after the conversion, and even more specifically after Shabtai Tzvi's death, it's not like Nathan stays the same. And he's right in the later years of his life, he's wandering around the Balkans, right? He's in this area which, there's been a lot written about Nathan and not nearly enough written about the Balkans, in my opinion, right? You have this fascinating place in between Eastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire with mixtures of Ladino and Yiddish and Ashkenazi and Sephardi. He's moving between these communities. He's in Sofia in Bulgaria. He's in Macedonia. He goes to Italy. He comes back. He's moving all over the place and connecting with people. And like I said, he's not encouraging people to stop being Jewish. Maybe don't fast on Tisha B'Av, but that's it, right? You're keeping halacha. He's writing, it's true, he's writing huge works. Sefer HaBriyah, his biggest work of Kabbalah, is written in 1670. But he's not, and he's doing all sorts of things that are pushing Sabbateanism, but he's definitely not, it's not one-sided. At certain points, he has to admit he's forced to denounce his beliefs. Then he goes back and says, actually, I still believe, right? Depending on which rabbis are putting pressure on him. It's a long, complicated story, but what I'm trying to get at is that his relationship is not static. His relationship to Shabtai is not static, and his relationship to the people around him isn't either. And after Shabtai's death in 1676, Noam Leffler has shown in a recent article, he basically takes a vow of silence. And he says, I don't know what happened. The Mashiach was not supposed to die. And we don't really know what his theology was afterwards. It probably wasn't as radical as some later Sabbateans who developed a whole crazy theory of, Shabtai was taken up, but he's going to reappear, a second coming, right? All sorts of, quite abstruse and esoteric ideas. It's not clear that Nathan believed that. And it could be that the positive attitudes that we trace in later generations, when we are surprised at that, are related to the fact that these people were actually closer in time to Natan and had a more three-dimensional picture of who this person was in the last years of his life.
Right, absolutely. And to listeners, obviously, we're not, I'm not promoting Nathan. Obviously, there's issues there, but I'm just, the unique, like you're pointing out, that, the way he's been viewed, and you can see this in the writings of the people, the ones that we mentioned, Yaakov Emder, Moshe Chagiz, you mentioned Fataya and Chaim Pelagi, and others, there's this kind of interesting thing you see that's not the same as to other figures in the movement, which is what is interesting here. Just want to point out that's very interesting, something related to him. So,
can I just add one thing that I think is important also is there's different political agendas, right? We know Rabbi Yaakov Emden because he wrote so much, right? And his agenda was to attack and to create machlokes, right? And to create argument. And people like the Chida, right? He knew just as well as Rabbi Yaakov Emden, if not better, every little hidden, Sabbatean manuscript and hint. But he had a different approach. He said it's better to just keep quiet about these things and let it blow over. And I think, this is true to this day, right? It's not the fact that you make a big fuss about something that you consider is offensive. That's not necessarily the sole indicator of your opinion about a topic.
Right, sure. So something though interesting about Nathan, first of all, he end of his life. So he dies. I think it's in 1680, and you mentioned where he's buried. I mean, he travels around the end of his life, and he just dies, and he ends up buried there, right?
Right.
So, and you mentioned we're not getting into the story how he was in Venice and he's in Italy and he's put into the Cherem.
I mean, it should be noted at one point he goes to Rome and does some ritual, which is a long history of Jews going to Rome from Avram Abulafia to Shlomo Mocho, trying to, Rome as the symbol of Christianity, right? If Shabtai had been to Constantinople and Istanbul and dealt with Islam, so he's dealing with Christianity. He has a really fascinating active life. So I should say that.
Sure. The interesting part about him is, I mean, we've talked a lot about him, but Sholem has a lot about him in his book in Shop 60, and there's other things in other places. But Barney mentioned this in that article that I quoted before. There's no dedicated biography on him. There hasn't been a lot of specific scholarship, is that the right word, on him? And is there a reason for that? Why not?
I guess one thing that's true of Nathan, which I think is in some ways true of most Mikubalim, and this maybe is a project, I would say from where I'm sitting, this maybe is a problem of scholarship on Kabbalists at large, is that, and this Barnai points out, and I think he's totally right, you need two really quite different skill sets in order to deal with this material. You need to be a historian, so you need to know, where Skopje is on a map and what kind of society lived there, and the connections between the Balkans and Italy, whatever, all of these sort of realia, concrete things. And you also have to be the sort of person who wants to wade through manuscripts, which are extremely dense Kabbalistically, right? So some of the letters that Nathan writes are easy to read as historical documents. But when Nathan is talking about, which element was the first element to be created in the world, right? And was it water, or was it earth, or what exactly was the relationship between different types of light at the very beginning of creation, right? These are very abstract Kabbalistic concepts. Those are two different skill sets, and so it takes a scholar like Sholem, of whom there are very few, to do that sort of work. So I should say there are great pieces of work on Nathan's philosophy or Kabbalah. So Avi El-Kayam wrote his PhD about it, very important piece of work, many articles. Chaim Wierzchowski, a student of Sholem, wrote very important articles that are still worth reading. Lior Holzer has recently published Wierzchowski's text of Sefer Briah. So the texts are there, but we're waiting on a scholar who will have the sort of breadth to write something about Nathan that's as grounded and also as soaring as Sholem was able to write about Shabtai Tzvi. That said, the book about Nathan of Gaza basically is Sholem Shabtai Tzvi. So if you go through that, half the book at least is about Nathan. So it's not like there's nothing.
For sure. And then there's also a fair bit in Meir Ben Yo's Atnua Shabtait B'Yavan, right? And he has a decent amount in there as well. And then we get back to, full circle here where, Blima Books just published this B'Iqvot Mashiach, these texts. So, do you want to talk a little bit more about it? What is the texts that are in there? And then what does the new edition have that the old one, which was rare, as you said, did not have? Right.
So I guess what I would say, I should first really quote the editor, my teacher, Yonatan Meir, right? This publication, as he says, is a call to be aroused to do scholarly acts, right? And to scream out for a textual redemption, which has been put off for too long, right? So this is Yonatan. Anybody who knows him has a beautiful Hebrew and is pushing this vision, which is a continuation of Sholem's own vision, his own ideology of scholarship, which is that you need to create editions of texts in order to promote the field, right? And as many very, sophisticated takes on Sabbatean theology as have been published by people like Elliot Wolfson, Moshe Idel, many, many others, unless the texts are out there and accessible, at least on a basic level, you're not going to have the kind of work that would be necessary to bring these people to life. And so at Blima, we have all sorts of ideological goals. We're trying to move, books move people, people move books, but we're really partners in this.
And so, like I said, I'll link to the book and people can check out all of Blima's other books. Are there any other works that you're working on now that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, for sure. Well, before I talk about what else we have in the works, I will just say that for anybody who is lucky enough to have the first edition, the 1944 edition of B'Iqvot Mashiach, I just want to make the plug why you should still buy this book. And the reasons for that are because a bunch of texts have been added. First of all, notes based on Sholom's own notes in his copy, where he corrected his own copy and filled it out with later literature. All the secondary literature that's related to these texts, which has been written in the 80 years since then. So that's important. And then a few texts. The letter of Nathan to Raphael Yosef in Egypt, which is his first sort of propaganda text, which we spoke about. A new letter to the communities of Poland. A beautiful manuscript, which is actually in Berlin, where I'm sitting right now, which has diagrams of how Nathan conceives of the creation of the world, published by Yossi Chayes and Eliezer Baumgarten. And just in general, some filling out of the texts that had previously been edited. With regards to Blima, we're constantly growing. And I think our next goal, maybe this will be heretical, but our next goal is working on more prose and political writing in Hebrew. So some classics of Hebrew literature, like the writings of Yosef Chaim Brenner, and shorter political works by the philosopher Simon Weil, perhaps something by the famous self-professed non-Jewish Jew Yitzchak Deutscher, Isaac Deutscher. Different things, just sort of, I think we're trying to be as multifaceted as we can and bring out the works of Hillel Zeitlin and the works of Rav Aaron Shmuel Tamaris, writing classics of Eastern European rabbinic intellectual life, and also newer works. And I'm sure there's all sorts of things that I haven't even dreamt of yet that in the years to come we're going to be able to bring. And I hope you all will check us out and look at our catalog and be in touch. Just drop an email.
Two quick questions. First of all, the previous work before this one, B'Iqvot Mashiach, was also on Sabbatianism, I believe.
Yeah, that's very important to mention. Also, Yonatan Meir has been working on all of these different Sabbatian texts of Sholom and published really a wonderful book called Toldot HaTnuah Shabta'it, sort of an overview of Sabbatianism based on Sholom's notes. The introduction to that work has been translated into English and is now available from Blima. And it's an essential guide to Sholom's work on Sabbatianism that's informed by his archive, right? Sholom's archive is sitting in Jerusalem. And once you go through that archive, as Professor Meir has done, you see that it's a very multifaceted process, right? Sholom is working on this material for years, and there are all sorts of stages in his research. So this is really a key for those people interested either in Sabbatianism, but also in Sholom and his sort of personal growth as a scholar.
Are Hillel Zeitlin's works, you did 2 books, are those available? Those are out of print right now.
So 2 works of Hillel Zeitlin, 2 collections of essays are available. We just did a reprinting, a second run of our book, Masaot Bashevis Be'eretz Yisrael, which is a really beautiful little travelogue by Isaac Bashevis Singer of his trip to Israel in the 50s, with a lot of really interesting observations about the young state of Israel. And the writings of Aaron Shmuel Tamaris, Knesset Yisrael v'Milchamot HaGoyim, a really beautiful pacifist tract written in the aftermath of World War I, that is also still available, and we'll be happy to mail it to the States or to anywhere else in the world.
That's what I was going to ask. These are linked to the Israeli website at price in shekels, but it is able to be ordered to the United States or elsewhere.
Yeah, and if there are people who are having trouble with the website for whatever reason, you're more than welcome to just send us an email. It should work, but you never know.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for joining me, Avinoam. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun.